They built more than 1,500 ships. These ships carried 28,000 people. They were looking for the Kirin. Kirin is a mythological creature that bestows legitimacy on the Chinese throne. We're going to be talking today about the Chinese treasure fleet. It's an historical truth that most people know very little about, and many people don't believe it ever happened. That it's all mythological. But in 2022, just 3 years ago, 2 of the Chinese treasure fleet ships were found, one in the South China Sea and one in the Guangzhou River, still fully loaded with the treasures they were carrying. So we now have absolute proof of these ships' existence. Now, why do we know so little about this? Because it is a part of China's history and was part of this history, is that when the Chinese decide not to do something anymore, they burn all the records of what they had done. They also destroy the things that they had made, and they tend to execute people who actually were involved, like the engineers and the architects and things of that nature. It is how China historically operates, especially when the Confucians are in charge, who are the Mandarin and the Han Chinese. So most of what happened in our story was destroyed by the Chinese themselves. And we only know what we know because there were a few people who are sort of on the peripheral of these expeditions who wrote about these things in their own diaries and their own records so that we know a little bit. So the Chinese treasure fleet. China, of course, has always been an inward nation. They also believed during the Ming dynasty that they were called on to rule the earth. The Mongolians had defeated China in a series of wars by Genghis Khan, and then between Genghis Khan and his grandson Kublai Khan, they ruled China for 74 years. During that 74-year time period is when Marco Polo shows up. Marco Polo spends 10 years with Kublai Khan at his palace, goes back to Italy, writes what he saw and did. The Italians said he was a liar, and because he was a liar, he needed to be in prison. They threw him in prison. Didn't believe a word of what he wrote. Thought it was impossible for China to be that advanced. But the reason Marco Polo was already famous is because he was an admiral in the Navy and he had won wars for the Italians. So when they were attacked again and at war again, they went to prison and said, "Can you please come help us again?" And he won another war. And after he won another war as a naval admiral, only then the Italians start believing what Marco Polo had written when the Mongolians were ruling China. So the Chinese finally overthrow the Mongolians, and the new dynasty that begins is the Ming dynasty. The Ming dynasty we are familiar with because of the famous porcelain that they created. But they come to believe that they are supposed to rule the world. So their emperor, Judy says we need to exhort soft power. And by soft power, it means do not attack your enemy, but force your enemy to pay you tribute. So his idea was every country that China is anywhere near needs to pay us tribute, give us money so that we won't attack them. This comes from the old Sun Tzu, the ancient Chinese philosopher, who wrote, of course, The Art of War, who said, if you have an advantage over your enemy, they will not attack and they will not fight you. So the idea was to go to the world and say, pay us money and we will leave you alone. Part of that also was to look for confirmation that their rule was empowered by God. They were looking for the Kirin. Kirin is a mythological creature that bestows legitimacy on the Chinese throne. So they're going Kirin hunting. But first, they've got to build the ships. And here's where it gets controversial. They didn't mess around. They built more than 1,500 ships. They made 7 voyages. Those 7 voyages, the smallest number of ships involved were 255. The largest number were 800. These ships carried 28,000 people, thousands of horses, food, governors, doctors, lawyers, tradesmen, prostitutes. Every port they visited, they made their prostitutes available to the people they were visiting on the boats. Food, water, and the largest of these ships, of which they made 138 of them, were more than 400 feet long. They were the largest wooden warships ever built in history. This is why finding 2 of them in the last 3 years has been so significant. Now, Judy also continued to fight against the Mongolians. And here is where it gets financially complicated. He sends 7 treasure fleets, again numbering as many as 800 ships and 28,000 men, all through Southeast Asia and Africa and the Middle East, and some historians believe also Antarctica, Caribbean, North and South America. I'll look at that some more in a minute. He's also fighting 3 major wars against the Mongolians to continue pacifying the North. He's also dying as he has a series of strokes. And there is a huge political conundrum that he's got to deal with. This is between the eunuchs and the Confucians. Now, the way China worked at this time, people would voluntarily become eunuchs so they have access to power. If you voluntarily became a eunuch and were given a position of authority, you become very, very wealthy, and you'd have the interior of the Chinese command at your disposal. Most of the eunuchs were actually Islamic from the Southwest. The Confucians were the Chinese who were in charge of the finances, the art, the culture, the literature. They were the bureaucrats who ran the country. Think of them as kind of a combination of our State Department and our FCC, et cetera. So those two are at odds with each other all through Chinese history, and always battling for strength and authority and power. And part of the problem from the Confucian point of view, if you're familiar with Confucianism, Confucianism teaches that no man should strive to be better than another man. This religion, which is almost 2,500 years old now, is the religion that the communist Chinese continue to fight against. Because historically, the reason China was such a backward inward nation is because Confucianism teaches that everybody should be agrarian, that everybody should be a farmer, nobody should be an architect, an engineer, a doctor, or a lawyer. It's anti-ambition, and it's anti-success. It's anti-trying to make yourself more educated than another man.
Ed, before you move on, there is a quick question on something.
You may have said this, but what century are we talking about?
1400s. The first fleet leaves in 1405. So the Confucians also believe that there are deadly sins that destroy a culture. Those sins are murder, theft, adultery, lying, deception, coarse language, foul language, anger, covetousness, and perversion. You basically just described the Navy through most of human history, no matter what country they came from. So the Confucians, who ran the government, were against the idea of sending a ship anywhere for any reason. But Judy overrules him. Judy also, because he's dying, he wants to move the capital from Nanjing to Beijing. So he's also building an entirely new city in Beijing, which is costing a fortune. Beijing literally means, in Chinese, pacification of the North. Now it's shortened to Northern Capital, Nanjing, Southern Capital. The ships are being built in Nanjing while Nanjing is still the capital. Now, pacification of the North, the idea is to build a new capital to illustrate to everyone in China we have defeated the Mongolians and we now control the North. It would be as if in our country, after various wars, we built a new capital and changed it and then named our capital Pacification of the South, pacification of Ohio, pacification of Pacific Northwest. It's very controversial. It is still very controversial. If you follow contemporary politics, you know the Mongolians and the Chinese are still at each other's throats. The very name of China's capital is an insult to the Mongolians. So he picks one of his closest friends to lead, Cheng He. Cheng He's grandfather actually served in the court of Kublai Khan. So he's got ties to the Mongolians. He is Muslim. His parents both made the trip to Mecca. So his parents have traveled extensively. He himself did not travel to Mecca as a child. He is a giant of a man. Chinese history say he's somewhere between 6'8" and 7 feet tall. He has a 55-inch waist. He is massive. He is an Islamic eunuch, but he also grew up with the emperor, Judy, and Judy trusts him implicitly and will continue to trust him. And Judy is not in the best of health. As he has these series of strokes, his doctors, as they're trying to heal him, are giving him cobalt, mercury, and arsenic. So they're basically killing him. And he did indeed die in one of the Mongolian campaigns. He died in the battlefield while fighting Mongolians, but he was not killed in battle. He died of a stroke. So Zheng He becomes in charge of this massive fleet, which is going to sail looking for trade and looking to try to pacify anybody they can reach. So if you know your Asian history, who was the first place they're going to try to pacify? Vietnam. They spent 100 years fighting the Vietnamese. Never did control it, never did occupy it. 100 years. If I may flash forward to some history, you remember when Fuchida radioed back to his aircraft carriers on December 7, 1941, he said, Tora, Tora, Tora. The next words that he spoke were, the Americans don't read history books. Meaning the Japanese always attack at dawn and they always attack on Sunday. That's part of their religion. Zheng He's trips sort of illustrate the same thing. China, which had 60 million people in it at this time, in 1405, is by far the largest country in the world, and they spend 100 years attacking the Vietnamese and cannot win. That's all I'm going to say about that. Don't want to get too political here. So, what is China taking? They're taking porcelain, silk, medicine, herbs, spices, incense, and ivory. What are they getting back? Cotton, pepper, pearls, coral, gold, silver, copper, wool, wine, ivory, rare woods for building, cinnamon, which they were addicted to, and the most important part of our story, lions, leopards, giraffes, ostriches, which they called feathered camels, elephants, and rhinoceroses, things that they never seen before. The reaction of the Confucians said, this is a waste of time and money. All these things that are being brought back here are curious and useless. Now, curious actually means, in their culture, weird. These things are weird and useless. I mean, they meant the same thing in British culture when Alice in Wonderland was written. Remember, she says things are curiouser and curiouser. She means weirder and weirder. So the Confucians is saying, we are spending the entire treasury's money chasing things that are worthless to our culture. So these 7 fleets sail between 1405 and 1433. In that 28-year time period, 7 treasure fleets numbering as many as 800 ships. Led by Zheng He, because he's now leading the Chinese military, he converts to Buddhism, and Zheng He becomes actually his new name. His old name in Islamic is Ma He. So, but he also is covering all his bases. He also publicly worships the ancient Chinese pantheistic goddess of the sea, Tianfeng. And he actually builds a temple to Tianfeng. So when he's out at sea with his troops, he's Buddhist, he's Islamic, and he's also a polytheist. So, covering all his bases. He has 28,000 men who have to answer to him, and that's a lot. So, he is also important to our story, because as you know from following the news, the Chinese are building ships. China's goal is to reach the Philippines and have control of the oceans all the way to the Philippines by 2050. They started on this goal about 22 years ago. That's why they're now building aircraft carriers and submarines. And they need a public symbol to help justify that to their people. And Zheng He has now been made the public symbol. He is now a very famous and important man in China after many, many years, after hundreds of years of refusing to admit that he ever did any of this stuff. Now they've made him a public hero, and he's being used like we use in our culture, your George Washingtons, your Davy Crockett's, Daniel Boone's, etc. Nanjing back then, and Shanghai now, primarily, yeah. Yeah, only a couple, and even those are connected to the sea by canals, and in fact, they built in rivers. Nanjing, where these ships are being built, is on the Yangtze River, but it's still inland, and so they still have to travel the river to get out. And then the Grand Canal to Beijing, which was built during Kublai Khan's time and then repaired during Zhudi's time, connects Beijing to everything. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Ed, can you real quick repeat that question just in case anybody didn't hear it?
Yeah, what are the major ports of China? Then and now. The Greeks did the same thing with Athens. Athens, they built a canal from the Mediterranean to Athens. Athens was not actually on the sea back then either. So this giant of a man is today claimed by the Chinese, the Islamics, the Confucians, the Southeast Asians, and Muslims all over the world. And this is actually one of the statues of him. This is actually a Muslim statue that they put up. This is in Sri Lanka, which was called Ceylon back then. And as this is one of the primary places that they traded with, especially for cinnamon. And his report, as Zheng Zhao would travel around, he would, when they made landfall, they would put a stone and he would write on the stone what was going on. And many of these stones still exist, and they're still in the same places that he left them all around Southeast Asia. The first one that he wrote, and it's disputed whether he wrote these when they got there or whether he pre-wrote them and brought them with him, because there's a lot of words on a stone. So the first one that he writes, the tablet that he's erected, we have traversed more than 100,000 lu of immense water spaces. Now 100,000 lu would be about 34,000 miles. We have traversed more than 100,000 lu of immense water spaces and have beheld in the ocean huge waves like mountains rising sky high. And we have set eyes on barbarian regions far away, hidden in a blue transparency of light vapors, while our sails, loftily unfurled like clouds day and night, continued their course as rapidly as a star, traversing those strange waves as if we were treading a public thoroughfare. All that on a stone. So yeah, he probably did pre-write it. So as part of this, China is now adopting a maritime history for the first time, and this is these trips between 1405 and 1433 are really all they have to go on. So they built a maritime museum, much like ours. It's in Guangzhou. It's actually larger than we are here. And here is a model of one of these treasure ships. They were 9-masted, 36-foot long rudders. And the primary ships were for treasure, and then there are also other types of ships in the fleet. You have equestrian ships carrying all the horses. You have supply ships. You have medical ships. You have ships just carrying weapons, and ships carrying food and water. You have warships. And one of the reasons all this is working is because what did the Chinese invented about 50 years before all this started? Gunpowder. They've got cannons. They've got cannons and they've got rockets, and everybody they encounter who tries to fight them is trying to fight some of these smaller countries they would go to. They would send 2,000 people to fight 28,000, and the 28,000 have cannons and rockets. They don't have a chance. They are getting wiped out. So another inscription that he wrote on one of these stones he left behind: barbarian kings who resisted transformation and were not respectful, we captured alive, and bandit soldiers who looted and plundered recklessly, we exterminated. Because of this, the sea lanes became pure and peaceful, and foreign peoples could rely upon them and pursue their occupations in safety. So that stone kind of gives you a hint of who else they were sent after. Pirates. They killed more than 5,000 pirates, and they sunk dozens of pirate ships. Anytime they came upon pirates, they would attack immediately, because one of the things Zhudi told his friend Zheng He to do is get rid of every pirate you see, so the sea lanes would be safe for trade. This is one of the smaller treasure ships. This would have been one of the equestrian ships that would have carried horses, and you can see it in comparison to size. That is a European ship of the same time period. So what kind of size difference are we really talking about? Here we go. This is one of the treasure ships up against the Santa Maria that Columbus was sailing. This gives you a good idea of the size. So these guys, up to 800 of these treasure fleet ships are coming to your coast with this kind of size and shape and power. And as you can probably ask yourself by the sheer size, how fast were they going? About 2.5 knots. 2.5 knots with a good wind, 1.5 with not out a good wind. These guys were slow. So it's really going to take them, so every trip that they took between 2 and 3 years. Now, if they really did go around the world, and there is much evidence that they did because Chinese artifacts from this time period have recently been found in Alaska, Pacific Northwest, South American coast, on the West Coast, and on the East Coast. Now, those things could have gotten there by trade and could have gotten there well after this time period, but there is historical evidence in some of the diaries of people that subsequent trips after Judy and Chung Ho were dead actually explored Antarctica, Australia, and the Caribbean and North and South America, and I'll show you evidence of that in a minute. And as one historian put it, if the Chinese had not backed off, when Columbus got to the Caribbean, he may have discovered Chinese junks. And when James Cook got to the Philippines, he may have run into Chinese junks. Question?
Is it known what form of navigation technology the Chinese used?
The stars. Yep. Strictly the stars. And here's an example. Here's the first map that Chung Ho took with him. This is the Kangnido map. This was actually a Korean map done in 1402. As you can see, it's not very accurate. Over there on the right, you've got Korea, China, Asia. This is supposed to be India. And here are all the islands they're going to stop at. A lot of their ports were in India, Sri Lanka, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand. Those are the types of places they're going to. And of course, whenever they're anywhere near the Vietnamese, they're fighting with them. Now, Chung Ho made his own map for subsequent trips. Now look at his map. Notice what's on there. Africa, North America, South America, Central America, Antarctica, Australia, Africa, Europe, Great Britain. This is the map he made in the 1420s. Now, he's either been a lot of places that we don't know he's been, or he had friends of his who had been to those places, and other ships and other fleets. There are at least 4 other ship commanders that might have gone to these places that we know about between 1421 and 1435. So this is an extraordinarily accurate map for this guy to be carrying around in the 1420s. Pretty much everything is on there. Everything that matters is on there that he's going to be visiting. And what part of the speculation is that they went as far north as San Francisco and then cut back over on the Pacific from San Francisco.
Got a question?
Yes.
You know, I kind of follow with Tim's question on navigation. Did they invent the magnetic compass? Because even that and longitude, I don't know a lot about navigating by the stars, but that is an amazing map. Mm-hmm. As all these things apply in latitude and longitude and everything. They
knew a lot about latitude, not longitude. And the other thing I left out is they're following the storms. Because these ships are so slow, they're sailing during the monsoon season, so the monsoons will push them. So and there's another reason why they were as big as they were. They're intentionally sailing with storm winds pushing them.
I understand.
Which, of course, they can't use the stars, and if they're in a storm, they can't see them.
Right.
Yeah.
But ultimately, did they invent the magnetic compass or not?
They say they did, but after this time period.
Okay.
Yeah. And they could very well have. I mean, because it's historically a closed culture, it's hard to know what they did or didn't invent. Now, when they're making these trades with people, the Chinese currency at this time period was rice. Metal money was against the law for peasants to own or for anybody outside of officials to own. So metal money did exist, but it very rarely left the palace. They invented paper money, which they called script, and the script was basically an IOU. They give script for trade, and as a result of this, Chinese paper money made its way all around the world as it got sent from country to country. But initially, it was only good to receive rice. By his last voyage, which ended in 1434, by his last voyage in 1434, you could in fact exchange your paper money for metal money, for money made out of silver and gold and copper. Copper was the primary metal they used for money. So the trips that he recorded in his writings, these are his primary orders to go specifically to these places for trade, and again, to express sea power. Part of the idea was, if you want to continue to exist as a country, you must give us whatever we ask, otherwise these soldiers will make sure you no longer exist as a country. So he was specifically ordered to go to Mogadishu, which is Somalia, Mombasa, which is Kenya, Aden, which of course the Gulf of Aden is still being raided by the Somalian pirates, Mecca, and then of course India and what was then called Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, and all through Southeast Asia. And then Jing, you see at the upper right, is where he's starting from. Now, problem is when he gets to Kenya, the Kenyans have very little to offer other than all these fancy animals. So Judi is now building the Forbidden City. If you saw the movie The Last Emperor, it was actually filmed in the Forbidden City. The Forbidden City in Beijing, which became the capital, is built entirely out of wood, and there's no stone or brick, and much of the wood used to build it was coming from overseas from these treasure fleets. One of the primary things they were told to obtain was wood. They wanted fancy woods from Africa and from India and Sri Lanka and from Southeast Asia that were aromatic and were solid and wouldn't decompose very easily. So on the 4th, 5th, and 6th of the 7 voyages, wood was their primary task, bringing back as much of the stuff as they could, because they were building Beijing quickly because the emperor wanted it done before he died. He did die before it was finished, and then his nephew took over. This, of course, is, for the Chinese people, their favorite tourist attraction, and many Americans like to go there too, just because it looks like it did when the emperor's time ended. So the Ming Dynasty creates famous Ming porcelain. And they figure out how to use cobalt and manganese to get all these spectacular colors. And of course, as you know, these pieces are worth a fortune now, to use as trade to obtain these things. And on many of the pieces, they put what they were looking for, which is the kirin.
Ed, real quick before you go,
Yes.
there's another question.
Yeah, on your last slide, the Forbidden City. Why do they call it the Forbidden City?
Because only the emperor's family and employees were allowed in there. Nobody else was allowed in, and no foreigner. It was a place that regular Chinese would have never seen, because they would have never had the opportunity to see it. That's one of the interesting things in comparison. When our founding fathers were doing their intellectual work to create our nation, that's one of the things that they were really focused on. It was creating a country and a capital that was open to the public and open to everybody. And of course, we still have that in our culture when we can go to DC and look at anything we want to look at. We could even go to the White House and go to the Capitol, stuff like that. In the ancient Chinese tradition, nobody was allowed in there. Yes?
How large is the Forbidden City?
Oh, it's thousands of acres. Yeah. It's thousands of acres. If you go there, I have not been there. If you go there, you can't see it in one day, or not even close. Of course, you're somewhat limited to where. And it was surrounded by gardens and forests and things like that. It was well cut off from the rest of the people of China. So on part of this Ming, they've got the Kirin. I'm using the Japanese pronunciation because of Kirin beer. You can see that, and also my Chinese is not very good. But they created this idea of this mythological Kirin, and the myth was that said to have the body of a musk deer, the tail of an ox, the forehead of a wolf, the hoofs of a horse, fleshy horn like a unicorn. In legend, the Kirin had appeared before a young woman in the 6th century BC. It dropped a piece of jade into her hand on which was engraved a message that she would bear a son, but he would be a king without a throne. The son she bore was Confucius, whose philosophy of system and order was to dominate Chinese thought for over 2,000 years. So this is what they're looking for. This guy to fulfill a prophecy that's now 2,000 years old, 6th century BC to the 1400s. Another beautiful piece of Ming porcelain. And because of this treasure fleet, that's one reason why so many things got spread around the world. This is actually for oil. This one was used using manganese. Now, my wife is a potter. We have a pottery studio, and she uses these cobalt manganese also to create these kinds of images. And my wife also does fish. This is a water vessel. So they're taking thousands of these pieces to these other countries to trade for what they want. Here's Kirin again, 2 Kirins on here. Lots of manganese in this piece, Kirin again. And as you can see, the Kirin, the description I just gave you is they still draw like a dragon of some type, some kind of fierce thing. Sometimes he's portrayed with a lion's head, that type of thing. So he goes to Mombasa, Kenya, 4th voyage of the 7, and he brings back giraffes. And when he brings back giraffes, they look at the giraffe and say, "That's it, the Kirin." As far as they were concerned, this giraffe looked like a Kirin. This painting was actually done by Shindu in 1414. He was the official artist of the emperor. So he's sort of like the portrait guy. So we know that this actually happened because this is not some artist out in a village making something up. We know the giraffe actually was brought into the palace in the Forbidden City that was being built to meet Zhu Di, the emperor. And Zhu Di said, now that we have the Kirin, that gives us legitimacy to move the capital permanently to Beijing. They were using both there for a while, and to continue to pacify the North and to unify as one country. If you know your Chinese history, it's so spread out. There are thousands of languages, there are hundreds of ethnic groups. Unifying that country has always been very, very difficult. Even today, there are villages in remote parts of the mountains that don't know the Chinese government even exists, and the Chinese government ignores them. It's a very difficult place to unify. So Zhu Di uses this giraffe as proof that China is the chosen country and they are to rule the world. And that the Middle Kingdom that he's in charge of, that he is to rule the Middle Kingdom. So this poor giraffe ends up kind of changing world history. So they went and got some more. So they finally got a group of about 24, and they built this beautiful preserve for them outside of the Forbidden City of hundreds of acres for these 24 giraffes to have babies and for all of them to live a long and productive life. And for hundreds of years, there were giraffes living at the Forbidden City that they are, of course, calling the Kirin. So he believes he now has legitimacy. That, of course, does not change any of the disagreements between the Confucians and the eunuchs and the Muslims. The eunuchs were actually put in charge of the military, so the Confucians can't really use force to disrupt what they're trying to do, but they are still concerned about the complete loss of finances with the treasure fleets, the building of Beijing, the wars against the Mongolians. They are out of money. They are completely out of money, and that's going to cause many, many difficulties, because one reason people are going on these trips is for money. Under the Chinese system, if you went on an expedition, whether it was over land or over sea, to conquer your enemy, and you successfully did so, you got paid a lot of money in bonuses. And sort of like the law of prize that has existed all through naval history, you take the enemy ship, you get paid the amount of money that the enemy ship is worth, and everybody divides it up equally, and everybody gets an equal share, except for the captain and quartermaster who get a double share. So there are more than enough volunteers to go on these trips, and this is going to cause a political rift when the Confucians continue to push the emperor to stop all of this. Stop the building, leave the capital Nanjing, stop the treasure fleets, stop the wars against the Mongolians. And Zhu Di dies on the battlefield, actually, all it was from a stroke. And he's buried in one of these Ming tombs. Now, notice the interesting thing about the Ming tombs. Nothing is aligned, nothing's in a straight line. They did this on purpose. They believed that evil spirits always travel in a straight line, and they're only capable of traveling in a straight line. So if you mix up the tunes, they can't get through them because they can't turn. So the Ming during the Ming Dynasty, everything that is created is patchwork. It looks like there's mass confusion going on, and that's on purpose. Of course, seeing the things that are put in these Ming tombs, of course, is spectacular. First time I got to see them in person was 1982 at the World's Fair. It was just incredible to see these statues from the Ming tombs that were brought out and were touring the U.S. They toured the U.S. other times since, but that was the first time that I saw them. This is a statue of Kirin, which looks nothing like a giraffe, guarding the Ming tombs. This is their mythological symbol of power, of wealth, and of legitimacy. And that's a key issue there, is legitimacy. And that is, if you follow Chinese politics at all, and I only do because I was required to while I'm working on my master's, it's still, legitimacy of government is still a major issue there, is who really is allowed to be in charge. And Confucianism is making a massive comeback, and the Chinese government is terrified because of Confucianism historically teaches people not to succeed. And so what the Chinese government is doing now, the Confucians would be against, just like they were in the 1400s. So there are massive conflicts over there involving this. And the Confucians, who are, many of the leaders in that group are exiled to here, and they're actually in the United States right now. They also got elephants from Africa also. These elephants are also guarding the tombs of the Ming Dynasty, which lasted for about 250 years. And this is pretty cool. At least it looks like an elephant. And now they had seen Asian elephants before in previous trips, including land trips. The Burmese actually use Asian elephants as cavalry rather than horses. And back in about 340 BC, that's who defeated Alexander the Great on his conquest. His cavalry ran into the Burmese elephant cavalry, and that was a little too much to handle. And his soldiers kept saying, we need to turn around and go back. And after that debacle against the elephant cavalry, he said, yeah, you're right, let's go. Let's go back to Greece. So they were very familiar with Asian elephants and using them, but they'd never seen an African elephant before. They are very different. And so this is an African elephant that's guarding the tomb. And by using the symbol of a giraffe from Africa and an elephant from Africa. These tomb guards are also telling the world that we, the Chinese, are actually the rightful rulers of the world. All because they found a giraffe. So, and then here's a stone warrior guarding the tomb. These are the kinds of warriors that, of course, toured the United States back in 1982 and occasionally do at other times. Now, I want to go back. To the treasure ship. Okay, so the treasure ships are going to be 9-masted, and then the equine ships are going to be 7-masted. The warships are only going to be 5-masted, and the supply ships are also 7-masted. Everything was between 5 and 9. And one of the great questions that's always been asked by historians is, how would this be possible without it sinking? It's just too heavy for the technology and the design. And what they had to do was speculate based on some obscure writings. And then when the question is, how long do you make the keel? How is everything attached? And then when they found 2 of these actual ships in 2002, some of those questions were answered. And these are extraordinarily wide too. They're basically, even though they're ships, are basically floating barges being powered by sail. They're extremely slow and not maneuverable at all. They're primarily used to carry things, not to do a full-scale attack, but because of the sheer numbers of troops on board, they could disembark. They carried oar-based ships to get the troops aboard, and they tended to land in force so that the enemy is automatically going to say, okay, whatever you want. That is what Sun Tzu wrote in The Art of War. The best way you win a battle without ever actually getting into combat is just having overwhelming force at all times. And that became the prominent philosophy fighting wars for many time periods, including in our Civil War. When massing infantry, I mass more infantry than you mass, I win. It was still the philosophy until more modern times. The Chinese still use these types of mass because they had 60 million people then, but they got 1.2 billion now. And their whole system is based on extreme size and extreme mass. For instance, in the Chinese film industry, and if you've ever seen any Chinese war films, they make great war films, they're really good. But they have a city that has more than 100,000 people living in it, and all those people work for the movie industry. And they're the extras that are in all the films. So when they're doing a war film, they've got 100,000 people they can put in uniform, and they actually shoot their films where they actually reenact the battles as they were fought with the same number of people who fought in them. And then they shoot them with aerial cameras so you can tell what's going on all the time. And it's really cool to watch. So if you get a chance to watch a Chinese war film, take it. So this sheer mass, so they were built this large not to carry as many giraffes and elephants and pieces of wood back, but they really were carrying soldiers. They were essentially mobile tanks is what they are. And since nobody else has artillery, there's nothing you can do to defend yourself against them or to defeat them. But at the same time, they're not maneuverable enough they could fight in a naval battle in any way, shape, or form. The philosophy of the West, especially during the British and the French wars, is maneuverability and speed. And we have a question here.
How many fighting men were on those ships?
Of the 28,000 people they were carrying, about 23,000 are fighting men.
23,000?
Yeah. Yeah, and most of the places that they landed could only put between 2,000 and 5,000 maximum to fight back. The largest army they fought against was 5,000. The smallest army they fought against was 1,000. But I should point out, I don't want to overemphasize that, because of the 7 trips that they made, they only had to fight battles on 3 of the 7. Once word got out, as soon as you saw the ships coming, you just kind of, okay, they're here. And because they move so slow, you saw them coming for a very long time. You know, they're coming in the port at if the wind's not blowing 1.5 knots, you know.
And there's another question
Okay.
right here.
It looks like, when you mentioned about the ending of this era being 1430, so there would have been no cross of any of the European exploration
Correct.
ships at all, right?
Correct. Yes, no cross at all. And that's one of the interesting questions that this whole story brings up, which again, many Western historians didn't believe a word of this stuff for a very long time, but now there's more and more proof is where they actually went and why they didn't stay, and what their actual point, long-term point was, whether they even had a long-term point. So again, the 7 voyages are between 1405 and 1433. On the last one, he dies on the trip. He dies on the return trip. They're off the coast of India. Because he was born a Muslim, they gave him a Muslim burial at sea. And he was buried at sea, and then they built a tomb for him, even though he's not in it, in Nanjing, but his clothes are in there and his weapons are in there in the tomb. And then, because China is now using him as their John Paul Jones, the Chinese built a new tomb to him that was just completed a few years ago. It's in Nanjing. So the Chinese government is making a really big deal about this guy right now. Again, it uses this to justify their current shipbuilding and what they're trying to do, what they call sphere of influence, that they would like to take all the way to the Philippines, all through the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean. They also want to control the Indian Ocean. Now, with these fleets, they did take complete control of the Indian Ocean and all the small countries they're constantly dealing with. Go with the more accurate modern map. And one reason why historians in the West, in the modern world, have so much difficulty believing this is because they didn't think these ships were seaworthy enough to leave the coast. And they can't get to Africa without leaving the coast quickly. And so what Zheng He would do was go directly from India to Africa as quickly as he could, depending on the winds. But they did follow the seasons. There were times a year when these ships couldn't go anywhere. There wasn't enough wind. So they had what's known as a western monsoon season to push them west, and an eastern monsoon season to push them east. So they can get home. And that's another reason for the sheer size, is so they wouldn't be destroyed in storms. So the Southeast Asia, the only place they had a problem with was Vietnam. Everybody else acquiesced. Now, one of the problems that they had in Vietnam is the same problem that Magellan made. Magellan got involved in a local war and chose the wrong side and got himself killed. China got involved in a local war for control in Vietnam, chose the wrong side and lost. And then they continued fighting the winning side for 100 years, including assassinating the emperor and putting in their own person. That didn't work, just like we did in South Vietnam. And then so it just never worked out. And these two, of course, have been at each other's throats ever since. If you remember during the Vietnam War, the entire time the Vietnamese were fighting us and the French, they were also fighting the Chinese in the north. They were using Russian equipment to fight us, not Chinese equipment. They were firing shots at each other all during our Vietnam War and taking resources from the south. China was trying to take advantage of the fact that they were occupied in the south by harassing the north. So since the first time that China attacked Vietnam was 1405, and then it's never worked out very well for them since. And what did they actually need or want from Vietnam? As you can guess, rice. Before the French got there, rice was the primary production in Vietnam. The French replaced a lot of the rice production with rubber tree production. And when they made that switch to provide rubber for France, that's what put the Vietnamese on a starvation diet, because so much of the rice had been taken away. At this time period in Asia, with rice being the currency, it's not just a foodstuff, it's money. Control of rice paddies and control of rice growing regions can be paramount to your wealth. China's wealth has always been determined by things that are natural rather than by things that you can create more. This is not a culture that ever measured wealth in horses like the Mongolians and the Native Americans later, or in cattle like in Europe, or in sheep, or in even amount of land that you could produce crops in. It's based on one thing and only one thing, which means if there's a poor rice crop, you're in trouble. We started our country much the same way. If you remember early American history, money was tobacco leaves. You paid for things with tobacco leaves. And which means if you had a bad year, you lost money, you had less buying power. A good year, you had more. When Patrick Henry graduated from William and Mary, his first major case was the Anglican pastors who were being paid in tobacco leaves sued to be paid in real money because they said tobacco leaves often, if it was a bad crop, they couldn't service the parish the way it needed to be serviced. So they sued the British government. They lost. Patrick Henry lost his first case. But the idea was we need money rather than tobacco leaves. It took China thousands of years to make the transformation from rice to actual cash. Again, during this time period of the 7 treasure fleets, cash is illegal for the population to hold. And then they came up with the paper money scripts. And eventually, as they lost power and became more of an inward thinking culture, those scripts were less and less valuable, as just like Confederate money in our country gets to the point where it's only good to light a cigar with. So the new emperor, who's the nephew of Judy, he decides when he takes over that this whole operation is a bad idea. So the Confucians are able to regain power. They take all of these hundreds of ships and they burn them. They burn them and sink them. Some of them they took apart to reuse the wood. They execute many of the people involved. They go get all of the records, including the architectural drafting and the records of how much lumber was used and that kind of thing, and the information from the trips. They burn it all. The Confucians burn it all. They execute many of the people involved. Some of the people involved die of old age or other things. So the last official trip that was in the records from 1433, 1434, that range, not all the ships got back at the same time. That group becomes the last official trip of the 7. But occasionally, they're still going to send some other people out to do some exploration until the end of the 1400s, but the last ships that go out are in the 1470s. Some of those ships allegedly made it all the way to the west coast of the United States and possibly traversed the world before Magellan. Now, when the Chinese were operational, despite the few battles they fought and despite their demand to pay tribute to us, if you pay us, we won't attack you, they're still not trying to conquer the world. They're not trying to create colonies. They're not trying to expand their religion. They're not trying to expand their territory. The opposite of what the Europeans did when the Europeans got involved in just one generation later. If the last Chinese treasure ship is out there in the 1470s, and now, of course, Columbus is 1492, now the Europeans are getting involved, and the European version was indeed to conquer and expand territories. So the Chinese didn't stay, and the Chinese would leave behind in the major cities a few merchants, but they had no authority over anybody there. They were just kind of middlemen. They were kind of the retail guys, essentially, had no power over anybody in these various places. And they also destroyed many of the maps that were used, and even destroyed the names of all the officers, of the soldiers, the rank and file soldiers. They would not have had to destroy those records, most of whom were volunteers. And it completely gets lost to history until, again, about 20 years ago, when the Chinese went on this giant shipbuilding expedition. Historians started getting involved. This book, When China Ruled the Seas, by Louise Lafathis, is excellent. Biography of Chung Ho by British author is excellent. And the most controversial one Gavin Menzies, 1421, the year China discovered America. It's an entire book about how one of those treasure fleets did indeed go explore the Atlantic coast and the Pacific coast. This one's very controversial because of the lack of absolute proof. Although, again, Chinese artifacts from this time period have been found all up and down the west coast of South America and North America, which are part of his primary proofs. But those three books and a couple more are all we have, as occasionally the Chinese will find something that didn't get burned that they can use to further exemplify this. And that, back here real quick. This Maritime Museum in Guangzhou was originally built with 7,000 square feet. About 8 years ago, they expanded it to 31,000 square feet as they bring in more stuff and make this more of an emphasis. So they're rediscovering their history. It's a very popular place for Chinese tourists and American tourists is in Guangzhou, on the Guangzhou River. And that is where, within almost a mile of this is where one of the ships that was found recently in 2022. The other one, the one that was found in the South China Sea, was fully loaded. Thousands of artifacts on it that were preserved and survived the sinking. So that further offers proof of what they were taking back and forth, other than the records. Oh, it's only about the one on the river is only between 20 and 30 feet below, and the one on the South China Sea is only about 2,000 feet. They're not that deep. Yeah, the one they had found some hulks of others in the past that had been burned, and then the hulk had sunk, and they had found some of those in the past, which provided the original proof. And the books I just showed you were all written between 10 and 20 years ago, before even the recent discoveries, based on what was left of the burning hulks, because most of the bays that they were in, they burned them and then sunk them, and then the stuff's still down there, but over hundreds of years, people forget they're down there. And then, so the sheer size of these ships, which was a major controversy for Westerners, because we didn't build ships like that in the West during this time period, was considered to be unbelievable by Western historians, including by naval historians. Lo and behold, they found them. And going back to the difference with the Europeans, is the Europeans were looking at speed, and primarily more so than size, and they were looking at conquering rather than trade, or there's some exceptions to that. The French were more interested in trade, but the Western naval architects couldn't have even conceived of ships this large, because in Europe there would have been no particular reason for them. Yes?
Unrelated question. You referred to the emperor initially and his general, but why are we calling it the Ming Dynasty?
Oh, the Zhu Di's given name at birth is Zhu Di, and then but his name as the emperor is Yongli. Just like in the West, where whoever he gets put in charge adopts the name, Yongli becomes his name as emperor, and then his grandfather, who created the Ming Dynasty, the name comes from him. And then they replaced the Mongolians. The Mongolians had replaced the Yonghol dynasty. And they used the term dynasty the same way that Western Europeans would do the same with the Habsburg dynasty, the House of Hanover, that type of thing, the House of Stuart. So a House of Stuart or a House of Hanover may last for hundreds of years in England, and same thing in China. They give names to the dynasties based on who's related to who and how they're related to them. So Ming Dynasty is really a title, like a House of Hanover or House of Stuart. So Zhu Di once Zhu Di becomes emperor as a young man, he's known as Yongli for the rest of his life. But that's his title, his emperor name. Just like, it's kind of the same way in the West. Remember when Prince Philip died recently? Philip was not his name. He's Greek. That was his assigned name. And same thing, all the Elizabeths and the Henrys, they weren't born with those names. Another question? Right here.
Never mind, I forgot.
That's all right.
Oh, there is a question. Hold on.
Do you know what the theories are regarding the fact that they wanted to completely destroy these unbelievable vessels that they had created?
It's part of the Chinese have done this repeatedly over the years. Part of again, remember Confucianism starts in the 6th century BC. So part of that thought is to not have relationships with foreigners of any kind for any reason. You don't trade with them. You don't spend time with them. So whenever the Confucians had control and have power, the whole country would look inward and just cut itself off from the rest of the world. And so if you're trying to cut yourself off from the rest of the world, you got to get rid of the ships so that nobody can travel to the rest of the world. And then with all the mountains and deserts that China, one thing we Americans don't really understand about China is that much of that country is mountains and desert, and much of it's uninhabitable. Quite a bit of it. It's not like Russia. It's quite uninhabitable. And so a large population has actually very little space to live on. And so they really can't travel overland to expand. They would have to travel by sea, or somebody would have to come to them, and they were always opposed to that. Now, interestingly enough, during the time period that we're talking about, I'm going the wrong way here, excuse me. All right, and this map that the Koreans made in 1402, this is Korea, and part of what they're trying to tell the world is that they are in charge, that the Chinese and the Japanese actually work for them. And that was somewhat true at that time period. And then Japan went even more inward, and they stayed that way until the 1800s. But what really changed the mindset in China was the Opium Wars of the 1800s. The Chinese realized that by looking inward all the time, and the Japanese made the same discovery about the same time, that just left them farther and farther behind technologically, and they couldn't compete with the rest of the world, which means they couldn't defend themselves against the rest of the world. They were easy to conquer, and because they couldn't fight back. And the Japanese and the Chinese kind of figured that out about the same time because of European occupation and European technology. But for thousands of years, China just avoided the outside world as best they could. And because on the west they were separated by mountains and deserts, and on the east they were separated by mountains and deserts. On the west by the ocean, they could do that. But once the 1800s come along, and European powers are building train routes through their country and sailing iron warships into their harbors, they had to change. It took a long time to come. And if you remember, I think everybody here is old enough to remember, if you remember what Mao Zedong did in the 1960s during the Cultural Revolution, he was actually trying to take China back to ancient times. They were trying to destroy knowledge and destroy technology. And of course, just put them that much farther behind. And then when Deng took over, one of the first things they did after Mao died was they created in 1982 something called an economic zone. And all the economic zones, there are dozens of them now, the economic zones operate independently of the Chinese government as capitalistic enterprises. And that's where all their goods and technology are coming from. And they kind of operate outside of the government. Government has some control over them, but and that's what, starting in 1982, they finally, for the first time really in their history, said, we're going to join the rest of the world and quit being backward and isolated. And which brings us up to now. And then they figured out that we can't do that without controlling some of our sea lanes and getting ships out there that we build and we control and are protected by warships, which is why 20 years ago, this massive shipbuilding began. They have millions of shipbuilders. Their goal is to build up to 800 warships by 2050, and to actually have a complete sphere of influence all over those oceans and those seas. And now our government is now reacting to that and started to ramp up the shipbuilding here, not because of anything the Europeans are doing, but because of what China's doing. so that we can still control the Pacific. And that's what's interesting about this topic is we're talking about the time period 1405 to 1433, but it's all relevant now in what's happening now and how the Chinese government is using Chung Ho as their symbol of why it's necessary to convince the people, yeah, we need to be doing this. It's going to cost a lot of money to build 800 warships, but we need to be doing this. And he's our John Paul Jones or whatever that stands for that. Yes.
I remembered. So it really does look like what they did modern-wise, they dusted off this whole period and became the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But when they did that, that was all just land-based and just moving things. Exactly, just moving things. And that's been fairly effective from them. I mean, the workforce they have, this is one of the interesting things about those parts of the world. Russia has half the U.S. population, and half of their population lives within 60 miles of Moscow. But they're 5 times our landmass. Russia has 11 time zones. Russia is mostly just forest and desert and snow for the most part. China, however, is fertile enough to sustain a population of 1.2 billion people. Russia only has 160 million. But China is still hemmed in by the West. That's why they keep trying to take Tibet and those places to have more control of that side of their country. And just so they realized in the 1400s they needed to control the seas, and then they stopped. Now they've realized again they need to control the seas to move forward. In the long run, the treasure ships didn't accomplish anything. You know, they got some giraffes and some lions and leopards, and that's what the Confucians kept saying over and over again. We're spending all this money for useless, curious things, useless, weird things. What is the point? And then ultimately, they won the day. Ultimately, because they did control art, culture, literature, and finances. And the primary reason the Islamic eunuchs were involved is they were trying to gain power and move up in the world. And the best way to move up in the world was to volunteer to go do something in the name of the kingdom. It can be a land battle, a sea battle, whatever. And so they had no shortage of volunteers for that. Question back here.
We've got one more question and we're about to run out of time. So
Okay.
let me get this real quick and they'll come back to you.
So what was it technologically or environmentally that allowed the Chinese to build such large ships when the Europeans couldn't do it?
Well, what they did was they used a different system. The wrong way again. Okay, these ships have no keel. And so because they have no keel, their draft is only about 20 feet. And they have a 36-foot long rudder. And the rudder can be deployed even when they're run aground. And it can actually also be taken out of the water during, if necessary, during storms or something like that. So they're basically giant flat-bottom boats is what they are. Now, if you, I had the opportunity recently to tour the boats at Fort Eustis, and we have these same types of flat-bottom boats in our Navy and in our Army that are designed to carry tanks and large vehicles and things that are big and heavy. And in bad weather, they can only make a few knots too. And you remember when Gaza first started, our military built a pier in Gaza to get relief in there. Well, it was the ships at Fort Eustis that took all that stuff over there, and then the Americans that were based in Italy actually did the construction. Well, I talked to some of the captains from those ships who were on that trip. They said in these flat-bottom boats carrying iron and steel in an open ocean in bad weather, they're only making 2 knots, and it's up and it's down, and it's up and it's down, but it's designed not to sink. It's designed to carry really heavy stuff and not sink. These are the same way. They don't care how slow they go. They're carrying enough food and water that they can be out at sea for months, and they're flat bottomed so they can put all kinds of things in them, and they're content to just slowly go along. Whereas the European ships were specifically designed to fight wars. When you're fighting a war, you want maneuverability and speed, and the ability to fire your cannons in an open ocean. These ships could fire their cannons when they were in port or in harbors, not in the open sea. They couldn't hit the broadside of a barn in the open sea. And that ability to hit your target in an open sea is part of what changed world history. The British trained their gunners in an open sea in waves so they could fight in open seas. The French trained their gunners in harbors that were still and quiet. So when the French were actually fighting a sea battle against the British, their gunners couldn't hit their targets because they'd never been trained how. And the British would just mop them up. Well, these ships were never designed for a sea battle. They couldn't have fought in a sea battle. So think about a ship with no keel, flat bottom, and it's basically it's a barge with sails is what it is.